All right, let's dive in. This time, you've given us a really interesting mix of sources all about geographical fieldwork.
Yeah, it is quite a collection.
We've got, let's see, some academic papers, like laying out the theory,
Mhm.
some lecture notes that get into the nitty-gritty of specific techniques,
Oh, yeah.
and even a forum discussion with, like, geography professors and teachers going back and forth about how to bring all this stuff into the classroom.
It's pretty cool to see how they're all like wrestling with this shift, like how geographers are actually approaching their work. It's not just the natural world anymore.
Right.
It's way more interdisciplinary these days, blending that traditional focus with human perspectives, cultural landscapes and all that.
You're totally right. It's not just like mapping mountains and rivers anymore.
Right.
It's about how people fit into all that, how they interact with the environment, how they shape it, and how it shapes them right back.
Exactly. And a lot of these sources are really pushing for field work to be more engaging.
Yeah.
Less about memorizing facts and more about like really experiencing the concepts.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
I remember one professor even used those terms: geographical feet, geographical eyes, and geographical mind. It's like a call to adventure.
It totally is. And it kind of reminds me of this other concept that pops up a bunch, striated versus smooth spaces.
Okay, I gotta admit, that one went over my head a bit.
Oh, yeah.
What does that even mean?
So basically, the term comes from Professor Jian Sushin.
Okay.
And a striated space, it's super structured, rule-based, kind of like a chessboard, right? You're just trying to find the answer. It's that classic scientific method, like you form your hypothesis, test it out, analyze the results.
So that more traditional field work with all the measurements and mapping would kind of fall into that striated category.
Exactly. But Professor Gian is saying we also need this smoother approach, something more fluid, more open-ended, kind of like the game of Go, where strategy is more about adapting, exploring different possibilities.
I see where you're going with this. He's saying that smooth approach is better for understanding how humans and the environment, all that complex interaction.
Exactly. Instead of just objectively observing nature, we need to be thinking with it. Seeing how people actually live in these environments, how they adapt, how their cultures are shaped by it all.
I like that. Do any of the sources give us, like, concrete examples of this in action? Because, to be honest, thinking with wind sounds a little abstract.
Oh, there are some great ones. For example, they talk about the people living on the Mazoag Islands. Their entire lives depend on understanding the weather for navigation, fishing, everything. They've built up this incredibly nuanced knowledge passed down over generations.
Wow, that's so different from, like, most of us checking a weather app and not really thinking about it.
Right. And think about the research potential there.
Yeah.
You could study how they read cloud formations, interpret wind direction, even predict storms.
It's amazing. It makes you wonder what we've lost by, getting so reliant on technology.
It really does. And there's this other cool example from the Megang fishing village. Apparently, it's even more beautiful during storms because it shows how the community has adapted to such a dynamic environment.
That beauty probably comes at a price, though, right? Storms can be dangerous. I wonder what the sources say about, like, the risks and disruptions these communities face.
That's a great point. It actually reminds me of what Professor Chen Ying says
Yeah.
about how students need to observe more and lecture less. Actually getting out into the field lets them see these things for themselves.
He seems like a huge fan of, like, experiential learning. What stood out to you about his approach to fieldwork?
Well, he talks about this fieldwork site in Huli, Taichung, which is like this geographical borderland.
Okay.
So you've got these natural features like the Dajia River and the Huli Terrace intersecting with, all these human activities, irrigation systems, an old railway line, even a science park.
So it's a place where the lines between nature and human stuff gets kind of blurry.
Exactly. And these borderlands are like gold mines for geographers because they show that interplay, right? How people have changed the landscape, how they've responded to environmental challenges, how all of that shapes their culture, their way of life. It's like a living history book.
I love that. And speaking of bringing fieldwork to life, I was blown away by Professor Helide's all-department fieldwork trip.
Oh, yeah.
Dropping students in a totally new place and saying, okay, 2 days, come up with a research project. That's intense.
It's definitely a challenge, but it forces them to think on their feet, apply what they've learned. And the projects they came up with are incredible. One group studied bus driver anger, like mapping road rage incidents alongside land use patterns.
Wow.
Another assessed pedestrian path quality using GIS to visualize walkability scores.
So cool. Instead of just reading about these concepts, they're actually out there trying to solve real problems.
Exactly. And it gets to the heart of why fieldwork is so valuable. It's not just about knowing stuff. It's about knowing what to do with that knowledge,
Right.
How to think critically and spiritually.
But let's be real. fieldwork has its limits, especially when you're dealing with stuff that happened in the past. I remember one source mentioned time and space disconnects as a challenge.
Yeah.
So how do you study something you can't actually observe?
That's a big one, and that forum discussion had some really interesting takes on it.
Okay.
Professor He, for example, was really big on collaborating with local residents.
Hmm.
They often hold so much knowledge about the history of a place, how it's changed, how those changes have affected people. It's like tapping into living memory.
Makes you think about all the stuff that's not in textbooks, you know?
Yeah, and Professor He and Chen both talked about how the landscape itself can be a kind of compressed history.
Okay.
If you know how to read the clues, the land use, old structures, vegetation types, you can start to piece together past events.
It's like becoming a detective. And speaking of puzzles, Professor Jian brought up abductive reasoning.
Oh, right.
What is that exactly, and how does it apply to fieldwork?
Basically, abductive reasoning is about coming up with the best hypothesis you can, even if you don't have all the pieces. It's like, a detective using clues to build a case, even if some details are missing.
So instead of just deduction or induction, it's kind of using both, plus observation and maybe even a bit of intuition, to come up with the most likely explanation.
That's it, and it's super useful in fieldwork where you're often dealing with incomplete info or unclear evidence.
It's fascinating how all of these ideas, striated versus smooth, abductive reasoning, they all come together to paint this, richer picture of what fieldwork can be.
Totally. It's not just about collecting data. It's about understanding the world in all its complexity.
And that complexity includes, well, time itself. I mean, how do we reconcile those ideas of linear time, where we're always looking ahead, with that cyclical time that seems so central to a lot of cultures?
You're right. That's a huge question, and it's something we need to dig into more as we explore the practical and philosophical sides of fieldwork in a world that's constantly changing. Yeah, that tension between linear and cyclical time, it's a really interesting point. And it's something Professor Jian talks about quite a bit. He contrasts that linear way. We often see time, beginning, middle, end with a more cyclical understanding, like you find in a lot of cultures, especially those closely tied to nature.
Right. It's that sense of time being less about a straight line and more about those recurring patterns, the seasons changing tides coming in and out.
Exactly. And those patterns, they're not just background noise either. They shape daily life cultural practices, even how people relate to their environment.
Like the Mazoy Islanders, they have that deep understanding of the weather because their lives depend on it.
Right. They can read those subtle shifts in wind and cloud patterns in a way that most of us just can't. And they've developed these specific techniques and practices based on that knowledge. It's been honed over generations. It's fascinating.
It makes you think about how we design those fieldwork experiences. Are we being mindful of those cyclical rhythms?
Professor Jian argues that we need to be more aware. It's not just about fitting fieldwork into the academic calendar. It's about understanding how the timing might impact what students observe and learn.
So if you were studying a farming community, you wouldn't just show up randomly. You'd want to go during planting season or harvest to really see how those cycles affect their lives.
Exactly. And it's not just about observing the activity, it's about understanding the meaning behind it, the knowledge systems, the beliefs, the traditions that are woven into those rhythms.
It's like fieldwork becomes a way to step out of our own linear mindset and experience a different way of relating to time and nature.
It is, and while that might be a valuable lesson for students, I wonder if there's something we can all learn from this. Maybe being more attuned to cyclical time in our own lives, even in urban settings, could lead to a different kind of awareness.
It's a thought-provoking idea. It makes you wonder if our constant focus on progress and the future makes us miss those subtle cyclical patterns happening all around us.
It might, but speaking of the future, I think it's time we tackle that big question looming over all of this. What role will geographical fieldwork play in a world that's changing so rapidly?
It's almost paradoxical. On the one hand, technology is advancing so quickly, giving us these new ways to map and model and analyze the world remotely.
We have satellites, drones, all sorts of data visualization tools that give us incredibly detailed information without ever setting foot in the field.
But at the same time, we're facing these unprecedented environmental changes and social challenges that seem to demand a more grounded, human-centered understanding.
Exactly, and that tension is at the heart of this whole discussion about the future of fieldwork. Do we risk losing something essential by retreating behind our computer screens? Or can technology actually enhance our ability to do fieldwork in new and innovative ways?
It's a tough question. What insights did you glean from the sources?
Well, there are definitely arguments to be made on both sides. Professor Chen, for example, he worries about this issue of time compression. He points out that as the pace of change accelerates, it's becoming harder to study long-term processes.
Like, how can you observe the effects of climate change when those effects are unfolding faster than you can study them?
That's the talent. He suggests that geographers might need to develop new methods, perhaps incorporating more real-time data collection and analysis.
So instead of relying solely on traditional fieldwork methods, which can be really time-consuming, they might need to embrace technology to track changes more dynamically.
Right. Or they might need to focus on smaller scale studies that capture those subtle but significant shifts happening right under our noses, things that might be missed by those large scale data sets.
So fieldwork might become less about those grand expeditions and more about carefully observing those micro changes over shorter periods.
Perhaps, and then there's the question of what we lose by not being physically present in a place. Several sources emphasize the importance of sensory experience, interacting with the landscape and its people in a direct, embodied way.
It's that difference between reading a travel blog and actually traveling somewhere. You just can't replicate that depth of experience.
You can't. And there's also the element of serendipity. When you're in the field, you're open to those chance encounters, unexpected observations, things you'd never find from behind a computer screen.
So how do we reconcile those seemingly competing forces? The need to embrace technology and the value of that on-the-ground experience.
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. But maybe it's not about choosing one over the other, but finding ways to integrate them.
Maybe technology can become a tool that enhances our fieldwork, not replaces it, like using drones to map those hard-to-reach areas, or using sensors to track environmental changes in real time.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, as technology allows us to gather more data remotely, it will make those moments of direct, human-centered fieldwork even more valuable.
Because we'll be able to ask more targeted questions, focus our observations on the things that can't be captured by a machine.
That's a really insightful way to look at it, and it makes me think about the implications for education. If fieldwork is evolving in this way, how do we prepare the next generation of geographers and, frankly, just informed citizens?
That's a perfect segue to our final segment where we can explore that exciting and, let's be honest, challenging task of incorporating these evolving ideas about fieldwork into the classroom. Yeah, it really feels like we're at this turning point. We've got all this incredible technology that's changing how we learn about the world.
But there's also the sense that technology alone isn't enough. We still need people out there making those direct observations, talking to communities, getting that firsthand experience.
Exactly. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we prepare students to navigate this whole new landscape of geographical fieldwork?
Well, a lot of the sources we've been looking at offer some really inspiring examples.
Professor Chen's approach really stood out to me. He's such a strong advocate for experiential learning, getting students out of the classroom and into the field as much as possible.
Right. He talked about structuring his fieldwork trips to emphasize observation over lectures, encouraging students to be active participants, not just passive recipients of information.
It's like he's flipping the script on traditional teaching.
He is. He wants them to use all their senses, ask questions, come up with their own interpretations based on what they're experiencing.
And his example of that fieldwork trip to Huli Taichung was so vivid. That borderland area where you see the interplay of natural features and human activity, it seems like the perfect setting for that kind of learning.
It is. It allows students to see those abstract concepts from the textbook come to life in a really tangible way.
And then there's Professor E's All-Department Fieldwork Challenge, which is a whole other level.
Oh, yeah. Dropping students in a totally unfamiliar place and saying, okay, you have 2 days, develop a research project and present your findings. That's intense.
Talk about trial by fire. But the skills it develops are incredible problem-solving, adaptability, teamwork, not to mention research and presentation skills. It's like a crash course in real-world fieldwork.
And the fact that they're tackling real-world issues makes it even more compelling, like those project examples, the bus driver anger study and the pedestrian path quality assessment.
Those were so aggressive. It shows that even undergrads can make meaningful contributions when they're given the right tools and the opportunity.
And it also highlights the importance of interdisciplinary thinking. These projects weren't just about geography. They were drawing on insights from urban planning, transportation psychology, even data science.
It's that blending of perspectives that seems so key to how fieldwork is done these days.
It is, but I'm curious, how do you adapt these kinds of immersive experiences for younger students? It's one thing to challenge university students, but how do you bring these ideas down to a high school or even elementary school level?
That's a good question. It probably takes some creative thinking, finding ways to scale those experiences down without losing those core principles.
Maybe it starts with simple exercises, like having them map their schoolyard, observe different types of plants and animals, notice patterns of sunlight and shade, even how foot traffic changes at different times of day.
Or having them do these mini ethnographic studies, interviewing classmates or family members about their experiences in the neighborhood, their favorite places, their concerns.
Exactly. It's about getting them to think spatially, to observe their surroundings with a critical eye, to start asking those why and how questions that are at the heart of geographical inquiry.
And those are skills that go way beyond geography. They're essential for navigating life, for understanding these complex systems we're all a part of.
It makes you think about the broader societal benefits of fostering geographical literacy in a world that's increasingly interconnected and facing all sorts of complex challenges. Don't we need more people who can think spatially, who can analyze data, who can understand how human and natural systems are all connected?
Absolutely. And that brings us back to that big question about the role of fieldwork in a world that's changing so rapidly. There's no easy answer, is there?
Not at all. But based on everything we've discussed, it seems like fieldwork in some form will always be essential. It might evolve, it might become more integrated with technology, but that core principle of getting out there and experiencing the world firsthand will always be valuable.
Because no matter how advanced our technology gets, it's still people who make the decisions who shape the future. And those decisions are going to be better informed, more nuanced, more sensitive to the complexities of the world if they're grounded in that deep understanding of place, of how humans and the environment interact.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I hope it's sparked some new ideas for our listeners, maybe some inspiration to go out and explore the world with fresh eyes, to ask those why questions, to make their own discoveries.
The world is full of wonders just waiting to be uncovered. All we need to do is step outside and start looking, really looking.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own explorations. Until next time, keep those geographical eyes open and never stop asking questions.